Now, everybody in every state that's a deer hunter, everyone has bad regulations. Everyone has a bad DNR. It doesn't matter if you're in Michigan and you're complaining about Michigan, or you're in Iowa, which is a great fantasyland deer hunting state, or Missouri or Kentucky or Kansas. People always complain about their local DNR for some reason. They have bad deer regulations. And so I wanted to hit some of the top 5 here that are always the hot button of questions I get on YouTube, things we run into personally as well. And there's a lot of misconception out there, and there's also 2 sides to every story. Now this first one here, CWD sharpshooters, this is one that's a hot button with me. I don't think there's 2 sides to this other than misinformation and people being informed or not. I can tell you right off, I'm not a fan of sharpshooters, CWD sharpshooters. You have to remember my background. I started hunting in 2002 in Wisconsin, and that's when CWD first cropped up. And in every national magazine, most talking heads and mouths out there in the hunting industry said the sky was falling. And I can remember those. I was fearful. I thought, they even said that deer hunting east of the Mississippi is going to change forever. Folks, it hasn't. We're still waiting for the sky to fall. It's been since 2002. I can honestly say deer herds are better, and it has nothing to do with the over $20 million that they spent in CWD sharpshooters that came into Wisconsin. That was an overreach. It was a waste. And waste of resources, waste of taxpayer dollars. And I can tell you dozens of properties that I go to, and probably hundreds in these areas of CWD, including Michigan and Wisconsin, and now Minnesota, that regardless, nothing impacted those deer herds from the outside other than the people that were on their own properties. And it kind of goes back to your basic and personal responsibility. Dylan wrote an article quite a while ago. Dylan, was that 5 years ago on the site? I think it was when we were in the office in Coon Valley, so that was a while ago. But it was something about personal responsibility in the DNR blame game. And people have a lot more power, and I guess this would be the other side to this. People have a lot more power than they typically think in terms of hunting, creating a quality hunt and a quality herd. Everyone complains about what the neighbor's doing, when really what you do on your own property will ultimately impact, if you're doing it right and you're following the concepts that we teach about trying to create a daylight herd. Because again, it goes back to less than 5% of all whitetail properties have a daylight herd for mature bucks on their land. Meaning that mature bucks in the area, they'll focus on about 5% of the land or less. There's so few lands that meet the requirements. Does and fawns, young bucks, they can be everywhere. You can drive an ATV through a woods, you can watch them step up. You can hunt poorly, you can manage your scent poorly, and you're still gonna have some younger deer, does and fawns around because they can take a lot more stress and pressure. But when it comes to creating a quality herd, you have a lot more power than you think. And CWD sharpshooters, they go out with the thought of, we're going to shoot as many does as possible, we're going to lower the risk of CWD, and it doesn't make a dent. And I won't quote the research biologist, but there's someone I talk to all the time, and he's talked about that CWD and what man is doing to try to intervene is an incredible reach. And I'm not saying it couldn't potentially be a serious problem if it actually crosses over to humans someday, but it hasn't. And I have no fear that it will, and could someday, who knows. But bottom line is, there's a lot of overreach when it comes to CWD. I think it's a feel-good thing. There's a lot of companies, organizations, businesses that follow, we got to do this, we got to raise funds for this or that, when really they don't have any practical application or knowledge about what they're even talking about being in the field. It's one thing to look at scientific journals and reports and say, this is what we need to do. But when they're not actually out on land and talking to hunters, and I'll back up, they might talk to a few dozen hunters a year. They might talk to 10. They might be on different landowners' property for one reason. But when you're talking to thousands of landowners across the entire country, and let's back up, say 10,000, tens of thousands of landowners, you get a better feel of what's going on. So some people that are actually in the field working with landowners all the time, some people aren't. And there's a lot of misconception about CWD that it's going to be more serious than it is, and it might be. But again, in Wisconsin, we're still waiting for the sky to fall after 20 years, and it hasn't happened yet. What they're doing around here right now, and luckily none of my neighbors are doing it, because there'd be a knock on their door if they were. I'd go have a chat with them just to try to inform them. But they're putting bait piles out on Valentine's Day on the 14th. They had sharpshooters shooting at night with suppressors. Of course, you don't hear where they're at because they have suppressors or killing the deer. But bottom line is, they're trying to call deer, lower the numbers down, and it's a great way for sharpshooters to make money. I have no problem against them. But landowners have to invite these people onto their land, because I can say it would never happen on my land. I'll tell you that right now. And I know a lot of people around here it wouldn't happen. So it's just a few quick phone calls to make sure none of our neighbors were doing that. But bottom line is it wouldn't help the deer herd. It's an attack on a way of life, and it's not going to do anything long term for the deer herd. And thankfully, getting back to, you have a lot more control on your own land than you would otherwise think. And I don't want deer shot that are living here a mile away at night on a nocturnal parcel with bait piles by sharpshooters. That's a little bit different. That's a little bit more extreme. That's right up there with poachers and people doing anything that's illegal as far as the effect on the deer herd. Not that they're doing anything, it's all done legally the way they're doing it. But bottom line is there's a lot more control than you have to create a daylight deer herd. And some of these CWD regulations are an incredible overreach. You know what's crazy is you have a state like Wisconsin that's been doing this for 20 years. There's a great example of what works, what doesn't. And then you have a state like Michigan or Minnesota that does the exact dumb things that they did to begin with that didn't work that time. It didn't have any effect. But it's just a feel-good thing. Let's donate some money. Let's feel good about it. And just like taking care of the deer 365, sometimes it feels good, but it doesn't actually accomplish anything. Number 2, 1 buck regulation. Now this one's one that kind of near and dear to my heart because I've hunted since 1993 in Pennsylvania where they had 1 buck regulation for decades and decades, and then they went to a antler restriction. And then in Michigan we had, I remember a time where you could shoot 4 bucks. That was back in the late 80s. You could shoot 4 bucks with a gun and a bow. And then over here in Wisconsin, I've hunted since 2002, and there you could shoot 2 bucks. And I'll go through these, but a 1 buck regulation, basically you shoot 1 buck for the entire year. People say, in Michigan, for example, if we go to 1 buck, it's going to change the world. We're going to have great hunting. And then I look at a state like Pennsylvania that had it for decades, and I'm part of a deer camp where they've shot 170 bucks in 35 years, and 10 of those bucks were 8 points or greater during that entire time. Then they go to a antler point restriction, and in just simply 3 years, we're shooting 5 bucks that are 8 points or better just on one opening day. And the first 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, they accomplished what they hadn't in 35 years. And it wasn't through education, it was just simply a regulation. And it was because Pennsylvania has one of the greatest numbers of deer hunters in the entire country. Michigan at one time has had over 400,000 bow hunters. You compare that to a state like Kansas at 25,000. In Iowa, everyone knows I refer to Iowa as a fantasy land state, 65,000 bow hunters. But you can shoot 3 bucks in Iowa if you're a landowner. You get a landowner tag and you shoot a bow, gun. So you can shoot 3 bucks. Let's look over to Wisconsin. Wisconsin, you can shoot 2 bucks. And the season's open from typically mid-September, and the last few years, it's been open to the end of January for bow hunting. So a month longer, several weeks longer than a state like Michigan, similar number of hunters to Michigan, but you can shoot 2 bucks. You shoot 1 with a bow, 1 with a gun. Now you say, well, what's the difference? Wisconsin leads the nation in Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young entries, but you can shoot 2 bucks. The difference from Wisconsin to Michigan is Michigan has flat land that lowers buck age structure. When you have hills, appreciable hills of 80 to 100 feet in elevation or more, you raise buck age structure. It's pretty easy. It hides deer from deer, it hides deer from hunters. It separates hunters that don't want to go way back in the hills. I could do that in Pennsylvania. It's a pain in the butt. It's a lot of walking. And I can see as I get older, I'm not going to be doing that in Pennsylvania. If I went out and hunted there when I'm 80, I'll be like the guy that Mike Mansell that came out and hunted with me a while back. And he's walking around, maybe not exactly like this, but he has his barrel in one hand and he's using it as a cane, walking near the road. And he'd been hunting there. He was in his 80s, been hunting there his whole life. And it was cool to see him out there. But he was sticking really close to the road. And the hills separate hunters, keeps hunters out of certain areas, so that pushes buck age structure up over an area. Not to mention, Wisconsin has very little winter kill. So when you get up in northern Wisconsin, there's not a lot of winter kill compared to the UP of Michigan. UP of Michigan, you lose 50,000 fawns in an average winter. It's 50% of all fawns. In a bad winter, you lose 90% of all fawns that were born that year, and you lose 50% of the yearlings. Now again, a yearling buck is not a fawn. They're a year apart. Yearling buck is a year and a half when it goes into the fall. A fawn is about 6 months. So there's a difference between the two. So imagine that in a given year, you use 90% of all fawns and 50% of yearlings during a harsh winter. You get some winter kill in northern Michigan too. Then you get into areas in the UP of Michigan where it supports less than 3 deer per square mile. You get into areas, sandy, central, lower Michigan, Gaylord area, over to Alpena, it's sandy. So there's not great habitat, so poor habitat, a lot of sandy habitat, and heavy winter kill. Gaylord, Michigan, they average about 178 inches per year on an annual basis. So you compare state to state, similar hunter numbers, but habitat totally different. Even though you have 2 bucks, you've always been able to shoot 2 bucks, and even longer seasons in Wisconsin, yet the trophy and age class goes up just simply because of the habitat. There's different constraints that happen. And then you look at a state like Pennsylvania again, that's had 1 buck. It didn't really change till they went to antler restrictions. You can look down to a state like Iowa, you can shoot multiple bucks. You can say, well, Kentucky has a 1 buck regulation and they shoot giant bucks. Yes, and they only have 200,000 hunters, bow and gun combined. And that was a few years ago. It might be less now, more, I don't really know. But compare that to 800,000 that might go out to the woods with a gun as an army in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And then you add the bow hunter tags in there. So it's completely different compared to a state that only has 200,000 hunters going out to the woods, bow and gun combined. So you look at these, you might just try to compare. And I'm not saying a 1 buck regulation is horrible. What I am saying is you have to consider that you can't just have this mentality, if I get this, this is going to save the state. Compare it to other states that have already had it for decades, that are proven, that have similar hunter numbers. Compare it to states that have multiple bucks that you can shoot and what their bucks are. Kind of think outside the box. Always ask yourself why. And you might find that a 1 buck regulation isn't all it's cracked up to be, but it does limit hunter opportunity. I know in Minnesota here, when we were considering coming here, they have CWD hunts. And they have 3 buck tags for bow, gun, and muzzleloader now. It used to be just 1 buck tag. Living in Wisconsin, I thought I'd never want to have land or live in Minnesota because you can only shoot 1 buck. If I'm going to spend X amount of dollars for a home and land in Minnesota, I want to make sure I have recreational opportunity. This year I shot 1 buck in Minnesota, yet with those 2 extra tags, I was able to hunt to the exact last day of the season, put a lot of time in and have some fun. And that's kind of what it's all about. And I'm not saying I need to shoot 2 bucks every year. What I am saying is I just want to hunt to the end of the season. That extra buck tag gives me that opportunity. Wisconsin, I always like that. If I shoot a buck with a bow in the beginning, I still have gun season. Tend to hold out a little bit longer when you don't want to end your season. So those 2 bucks didn't have anything to do with anything but recreational opportunity. And I don't mind being in CWD's zone because back up to number 1, I don't think it amounts to a hill of beans with the local deer herd. I haven't seen that in any property I've ever gone to. And I go to a lot of high-end properties that are managed, and a lot of people spend a lot of dollars for those properties, and they have great results with or without CWD, and certainly with or without sharpshooters. Number 3, doe tags. This is something that I see. Unlimited doe tags on private land. Again, if you do it right, you can build a herd on private land even if everyone around you is shooting does. Because you're creating a daylight parcel. Deer move very small. They have a very small home range during the daylight, especially does and fawns. Very small. Probably 20% of what a buck is overall. But that buck's home range is at night too. So if you focus on those daylight parcel concepts, then what your neighbors are doing doesn't really amount to things. And I can guarantee if your neighbors are pounding does all the time, those deer aren't going to be on their property. They leave pretty quick. We used to see that all the time with our neighbors out in ag land that would pound the does for a day. They'd shoot a handful, shoot a couple button bucks, and then they wouldn't see any deer for several days or a week or more because they just wouldn't come back into that property. So that's all fine and dandy on private land. If you're doing a good job, you have private land, you can control it, you can create a daylight herd. The problem is on public land. And I'll even see this on public land where they don't even necessarily have unlimited tags, they just have an abundance of tags, or you can use your bow tag on it. So what happens is guys go out on public land, and it's very, very easy to lower a doe population or lower a deer population. You're shooting a lot of does on public land. There's a lot of hunters. They're not as picky. They're not looking at, this is my land, I want to manage for decades. They're looking at, this is public land, this is what I have to hunt, and I don't blame them for shooting a doe. I really don't. I think it's great. They want to get some venison, go out and shoot a doe on public land. Again, kind of going back to the 1 buck regulation and APRs, antler point restrictions, those are regulations. A lot of times those numbers are shrinking on public land, and I feel bad that public land hunters go out and they have to deal with very little deer numbers or very low deer numbers when simply that can be regulated. In certain areas there's low deer numbers, like certain areas where they had sharpshooters out in Wisconsin and almost devastated the herd on public land because again, you can control that on private land, you can't on public land. Just simply regulate. You can't shoot stinking does on public land if the numbers are low. And that's a pretty easy thing to do. You can look at large areas and say, there's not a lot of deer, don't have doe tags or don't make it legal for XYZ. Look at the Shawnee State Forest. I think it's 65,000 acres down in southern Ohio. The Wayne National Forest, I think, is 110,000 acres. Go up to Hiawatha National Forest up in the UP of Michigan. It's hundreds of thousands of acres. There's all kinds of big chunks of land where you could regulate this very easy by geographic location. And now everyone has HuntWise on their phone and other apps where you can see exactly where you're at, exact property boundaries, so you know if you're hunting in a no-doe zone or a doe zone. Unlimited doe tags. People complain about them. Let's look at it that way too. They're a management tool. Just because you have a tool doesn't mean you need to use it. We, and I say we because I have Dylan sitting here and I have Kevin Smith from Ohio, Pennsylvania. He's our habitat design consultant out there. He's out here doing some work with us this week. He's actually going to go to a client with me on Wednesday. He's been booking clients and booking up fast. I expect him to be full for the year by probably May. So Dylan and I are virtually full. We have a few fill-ins for Wisconsin in June, July, August, maybe, Dylan?
Yes, sir.
And I might stick 3 or 4 into that time, but other than that, we're full for the year. But bottom line is, so we look at it that, you know, people complain about doe tags and too many tags. Again, you can have that if you apply the concepts. You can keep deer on your land during the daylight. And again, there's that personal responsibility. But we as a group recommend hinge cutting on about 20% of all parcels. Sometimes 15%, 10%, just depends on the area more than another, but it's not very often. But it's a viable tool in the toolbox of habitat management. Miscanthus grass, I don't recommend it on probably 90% of my client parcels, but there's a place for it under power lines where you need that height of screening. It's a good product for that. Doesn't mean you use it all the time. And it's the same with doe permits. Just because you have a doe permit doesn't mean you have to use it. You have a personal responsibility to take a look at the land. Think of does as more population control, balance, some venison. But if you have low deer numbers, a doe permit's not appropriate, especially when it gets onto public land. We need to make smart decisions on doe permits, and even regulations by state agencies need to be a little bit smarter in specific locations that have low deer numbers. Number 4, early gun hunts. You know, we deal with this in Minnesota where it's the first Saturday in November, right during the rut. It kills a lot of deer. Now I look back to, it's different with Minnesota a little bit because they always had a 1 buck regulation. Of course, a lot of these areas didn't change till they had an antler point restriction, same kind of thing. But now there's CWD, so you have multiple tags. Back in the day when you only had 1 buck tag, it was a cool way to get gun hunters into the rut. Because if you have a gun season that goes to the 20th, starts the 20th of November, and you only have 1 buck tag, then unless a gun hunter specifically picked up a bow, a vertical bow, and had that time to practice and do a good job with it and bought a bow tag, then we're going to hunt during the rut. So at least gun hunt, so again, you know, both sides to everything. Then having that early buck season with a gun allowed gun hunters to take advantage of the rut. But boy, when you have multiple tags and you can hunt with crossbows now in a lot of bow states, during bow season, you have muzzleloader. There's a lot of recreational opportunity to spread out the hunt and take advantage of the rut, even if you're not a diehard gun hunter. I look at Pennsylvania. Used to open the Monday after Thanksgiving. Now it opens a Saturday after Thanksgiving. That's a late start. A lot of people in Michigan say, we need to have a later gun season. Well, it's the 15th of November. That's on the backsliding scale of most rut hunting opportunity in Michigan. I mean, it's really fading fast at that point. You rarely see bucks during the rut except on very unpressured, low-managed areas or well-managed areas. So even though Michigan, November 15th, all I can say is thank God that you don't have an opener on November 6th or November 5th or 7th like we have in Minnesota. And there's other states that have those early gun seasons too, or they have early muzzleloader seasons that act as gun seasons as well. So it's all a matter of perspective. You might be in Michigan thinking, man, we need a later start to the gun season. Just be thankful it's not early November. Thankful that you're on the backsliding and tail end of the rut and you're not really hunting that much rut activity. So I always kind of try to look at both sides. Number 5, no vertical bows. There's still some states out there that don't allow, for various reasons, vertical bows during gun season. Who really cares? Back in the day in Wisconsin, I think it was about 14 years ago, I remember calling the DNR around opening day because I brought a bow out to hunt and then realized you couldn't, and I just called to make sure of that because it was so dumbfounding to me that you couldn't use a vertical bow. And I had this DNR officer pick up from a station, from a field office, and say, you bow hunters, so right when someone starts out like that, you bow hunters already have 3 months to hunt. Why should you be able to hunt during our season? And boy, if I was a gun-only hunter, wouldn't you want all your neighbors just using vertical bows in the woods on opening day gun season? I would. That'd be a huge advantage for you. But the guy was so dead set against vertical bows that he didn't want to see them allowed during gun season. So it's kind of a passing rule. You know, Wisconsin since wised up. Minnesota, you can't use vertical bow during gun season. You can use a crossbow, but that's got caught up in the change from going from $1 to $3. It used to be, if you hadn't shot a buck with your bow, you can only shoot one a year. You just use your bow tag during gun season and hunt it. Now it's separate tags. So you can't shoot a deer, a buck with your bow and then hunt with a gun with your vertical bow during gun season. So that's kind of got caught up in the CWD changes. It just hasn't been changed. But there are states out there, I mean, kind of ridiculous that you can't use. And maybe that should have been the honorable mention one, because no Sunday hunting. There's still states out there that don't allow Sunday hunting. What better place to be closer to God than in the woods, in the outdoors, in a tree stand, on the ground, enjoying nature, out there, actually hunting the bounty that God gave us to harvest and feed our families, enjoy and manage. And who manages these deer? Hunters. Hunters do. Hunters manage a deer herd. It's a part of our relationship with the outdoors. It's a great thing to get out there on Sunday, enjoy that. And Kevin Smith, now he's sitting here. You know, Kevin, I think you told me that, and I remember we had camp rosters back during gun season where it was a spot for 25 people. And even though it wasn't mandated, we still filled ours, our camp roster, because we'd have to up to 17 hunters. But I know even bear hunting, you said you participated in bear drives back when you're 5 years old in Pennsylvania. You've been hunting your whole life. I mean, when were your early days of hunting?
Yeah, I mean, I remember being 5 and 6 years old, dying to go out on bear drives with our group. I mean, we had rosters of 25 guys. I remember reaching out to bear groups, not being able to be let in just because of the rosters being full. But geez, going back to when I was a little peanut, you know, walking through 1.5 feet of snow, going through all of that. I mean, how times have kind of changed between what you're speaking with Sunday hunting. I mean, my understanding, being from Pennsylvania, was always it was a day to give the farmers rest from the hunters, right?
Yeah.
And now we have 3 days we can hunt on Sundays.
Three Sundays.
Yeah, 3 Sundays.
Out of like 3.5 months, or
it's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I'll go out west and hunt. I hunt Ohio a little bit, and I get so used to hunting Sundays, and I come back to Pennsylvania, and it's like, man, how quickly I forget that I can't hunt on Sundays anymore. But they're changing, they're adapting, they're listening to hunters. I think changing the opening day from Monday to Saturday has tweaked a couple traditions in ways, but it's a good thing. I saw where there's a lot more people coming back to hunt on the weekend from out of state that maybe grew up hunting in Pennsylvania. So always pros and cons with everything, but the fact that they're starting to incorporate Sunday hunting has changed, I think, the landscape.
Definitely a step in the right direction.
For the better, absolutely.
And Dylan, you were out in Maine recently. Was that hunting on Sundays?
Maine is no hunting on Sundays as well.
Yeah, and that's it's unfortunate, because again, it goes back to recreational opportunity, and certainly not blasphemous to be out in the great outdoors, enjoying nature, and enjoying God's creation and God's bounty that was provided to us. So, but anyways, I'm sure you guys could think of a lot more deer regulations that you think stink. These are some of the ones that we have. Again, there's two sides to everything. I can understand, especially the $1 regulation. I can understand how people would think that would be a good thing just on paper. You reduce the number of buck tags. I remember back in the day in Michigan, it was probably 10, 12 years ago, the numbers were that only 4.3% of all hunters use that second tag. In theory, there's so many hunters, there's an oversaturation that if you didn't shoot that buck, someone else would, especially when we're talking public land, things like that. We're not talking private land as much. A lot of private land people, they already have a $1 regulation, or if you shoot a second buck, it has to be something you're going to put on the wall, or whatever regulation you want to have. But it kind of goes back to personal responsibility and how you choose to use those tags. I can understand how people want to have unlimited doe tags on public land because they want to feed their family, they want to go shoot some venison and enjoy that, but it is a resource that needs to be managed, and sometimes unlimited is not managed. That's why in the fishing world, it's so different. They have slot limits, size limits. They have Great Lakes that, and I'm talking about the Great Lakes, I'm talking about great bodies of water that have incredible fishing because they're so well managed with slot limits. And it's not all about that size, it's all about continuing to protect the resource so that more people can enjoy it and actually go out. You know, a lot of times I'm hunting for a big giant buck, and whatever that age might be in a state, and I'm doing it because, not because I think I'm going to shoot it when I go out and sit in that stand that day. I'm going out there and hunting because I have the opportunity to. So just having that opportunity and knowing you have a realistic opportunity, a realistic chance at even just going shooting a doe on public land is awesome, but you're not going to if you have unlimited tags. I can understand both sides to a lot of these, try to look at both sides, and what's cool about this is if you look at both sides, you try to understand both sides, you'll probably understand the whys a lot more. Why a 1 buck regulation works or doesn't, why 2 bucks in Wisconsin works, and why 3 bucks in Iowa works for landowners, and why 1 buck in those areas. I mean, if Wisconsin's leading in Pope and Young and Boone and Crockett entries, how can you improve that as far as age of bucks and antler quality? And again, it's not all about antlers, but there's a lot of deer in Wisconsin, a lot of recreational opportunities. So I just want to see people get out into the outdoors, understand both sides, and I think you'll understand if you look at all these different sides, then I think not only we understand the regulation, but you understand your fellow hunter as well. Just make sure you get outdoors, and regardless if someone's doing it legally, it's fun. Get in the outdoors, stay in the outdoors, and we can protect our hunting heritage for decades to come. Folks, I want to make sure you check out my web class video series, whether it's how to design your food plot program or how to design your property in general. And we have a new one coming out that'll be how to hunt the rut. But these bucks back here are a testament. Some of these bucks go back to 93. They're even in different states. I urge you to check out those web classes so that you can help yourself, help your land, help your hunt. The link is in the description. And also for those that have tried them out, I encourage you to offer some feedback in the comments below. Thank you.